Okay, so today we've talked about Hinduism, we've talked about Buddhism. We're now moving to another part of the world, which is the ancient Near Eastern world. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history, key moments in the history of Judaism, key figures, key beliefs, and key concerns. So as Christians, and because sometimes I've taught on the Hebrew Bible or taught on the history of Israel. I've been coming to third pres for over 25 years. So I've taught a little bit about Judaism, but I've always stayed in antiquity because that's my area of expertise, and I've primarily focused on biblical topics. So I'll start in antiquity, but I'll move us forward. But we do need to start in antiquity because the forms of Judaism that exist today are radically different than the forms of Judaism that are described in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things that I talk about in my courses, which talk about Hebrew, where we're reading Hebrew Bible, we're talking about ancient Judaism, is look at all the things that these ancient Jews are doing. Right? We're not doing any of those things. We're not engaging in animal sacrifice. We're not, we don't have temples anymore. Synagogues might be called temples, but they are not temples. We have to understand, I think, a bit to understand what Judaism is today. We have to understand its history, I think, a bit more than in the case of Hinduism and Buddhism, because Judaism is a religion that grounds itself in its historical understanding of where it fits in human society. Okay, so if we look, let's start with biblical history. And if you look at the Bible is really the story of the origins of the Jewish people, their struggles to become a true nation state and their success in that, and then the dissolution of that nation state until the 1940s, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. That really is the story of the Bible. And it begins in Genesis as the story of a family. The originating moment in the Hebrew Bible is the story of one man, Abraham, who is selected by the Israelite God Yahweh as a man of faith to make a covenant. And the notion of covenant is central to Jewish understanding. Their relationship with their God is a contractual agreement. The word covenant means bond or fetter. It's a key notion. There's many different covenants in Judaism. But it has this sense of obligation. And that's one of the things about Judaism is this sense of moral and ethical obligation to other people, and to your community, as well as to God, and the notion that those are integrally linked. Also, the notion that God has obligations to us as Jews, right? It's an unequal contract covenant. God's obviously more powerful, but it is nevertheless an agreement. And the promise made to Abraham is a promise that variously interpreted is obviously still having ramifications today. And that promise was that if you agree to worship me and only me, I will give you the land as far as you can see, east, north, south, and west, to be yours, and I will make from you a great nation. So this idea that the people of Israel have a national identity, that it's not just a religious identity, but that it's also a national identity, a nationality, and the idea that it's connected to the land, obviously is still continuing to have issues now today. So that idea that Israel has to be connected to the land is one that has waxed and waned over the years, because as we'll see, Israel is for a long time out of the land. So that is the key agreement. It's an agreement with the family, and the people of Israel understand their origins as being that of a family. Now, as I like to tell my students, it's a dysfunctional family, right? It's a family that has a lot of issues, but the story of Genesis is telling about how that family grows from being a family to being such a large family that they end up dividing themselves into tribes. So they understand themselves as tribal groups. And the story is also, in the book of Genesis, is also a story, which is another theme that carries throughout the history of Judaism. What is our relationship as Jews to other people? to other peoples and other groups. And one of the main themes in the Bible is we recognize that we're very much like other people. In the ancient Near Eastern world, we're like the Canaanites, we're like the Edomites, we're like the Moabites, we're like the Ammonites, we're like all those people, but we have a special relationship with the Creator God. We have a special position. We're the chosen people, but we also have special obligation. But also we are different, and there are all sorts of ways in which they try to say that they're different. Because if you read against the grain, you can see they don't seem to be all that different. And lots of people are happy to intermarry or sometimes worship the other gods. You know, you've got like the party line, worship me and only me. And then you've got the reality of the Bible where you can see the ancient Israelites are happy to worship a lot of other gods. Okay, so those people and those tribes, they all end up having to go to Egypt. They have to leave the land that God promised them. Turned out not to be such a great land because there's a famine. Yes, Anne.
Basic question about where Abraham was from. I thought he came out of the Fertile Crescent.
He does. He comes out of, he's a man from Ur, right, which is just a region, and he travels to Israel. And
So he got chosen when he was in Israel, not
Yes.
in the Fertile Crescent.
exactly, because he says, I can see northeast, southwest.
Well, that's important. He's an immigrant himself.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Well, Jews are very much,
Immigrants.
are very much, throughout the Hebrew Bible, constantly reminding themselves, at one time you used to be outside of the land and needed help and support. And so you should treat the sojourner, the immigrant, as a member of your own society. So that is in Jewish law. So they end up, as you know, getting enslaved according to the Hebrew Bible. And it is not clear historically how long the Jewish people are enslaved. It's not clear. Could be 200 years, could be 400 years. It's absolutely not clear. But they're out of the land for a very long time until a leader rises up in the figure of Moses and he leads them out in the famous story of the Exodus. And they wander for a while before eventually coming back. And finally, in and around the year 1250 BCE, they finally returned back to the land in 1250 BCE, 1,000 years after God has made that promise to Abraham. So they finally make it back into the land and they just settle there. They have lots of skirmishes. Archaeological evidence shows us that they all lived in very established new and also moved into existing small agricultural villages. It's a very poor nation. Nobody is living in fancy houses. There's no central administration buildings. Different tribes are living in different regions. And they just come together for purposes of worship annually and to fight off and stave off these kinds of enemies. Well, for the next couple hundred years, they're living like that. And on the one hand, things are great. And on the other hand, things aren't great because there's other people living there, right? The land wasn't just empty when they were gone for hundreds of years. There are other people who are living there who are the Midianites, the Ammonites, new people come, the Philistines. The Philistines come and land on the shores and want to establish cities and take control over the area. So they're constantly fighting off people who want to take over their territory. And again, this is part and parcel of Israel's history, again, to this day, which is why these things are so deeply, what's going on in the current situation has such deep roots in the socio-cultural and religious psyche of many people who are Jewish. So they basically say to themselves, you know what, this isn't working. This isn't working. We are a small country living in these small agricultural villages. This is not working. We need a centralized leader. We need a standing army instead of these ad hoc kind of guerrilla forces that are fighting people off. We need to have a monarchy. And so they establish a monarchy. And the monarchy is eventually incredibly successful. The most famous king, there's 3 kings of the main monarchy: Saul, false start, David, and then Solomon. And David and Solomon really turned the nation of Israel truly into a nation state. There really is not a nation state until that point, until around the year 1000 BCE, when they finally have secure sovereign control over the land that they think God promised them. So they expand the borders, and then Solomon because his dad, David, was able to create military security, was able to turn to infrastructure. So during the time, I mean, this is what it says in the Bible, that he engaged in lots of building. He builds the temple in Jerusalem. All sorts of building and road building, all kinds of infrastructure work is actually borne out by the archaeological evidence. That this was a time when you start to see more and more walled cities. You start to see people moving from agricultural villages to urban areas. It really fundamentally shifts. One of the things that's fascinating is that the people of Israel, this is what the only ancient nation state that we know of where we have documented the establishment of a monarchy. Every other ancient, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, we don't have records of them before monarchy. So that's a kind of fascinating thing from a historical sociological perspective. But that decision to move to monarchy was troubling to many people, both theologically and socioeconomically. That theologically, right, God is their king. They don't need an earthly king. So there were lots of people who were upset about that. Primarily Samuel, and God says to him, like, don't worry, I'm used to these people not treating me nice. Don't take it personally. So that, but more importantly, socioeconomically, that if you have kings are not going to just be happy to be like everybody else. They're not going to live in the same house that everybody else lives in. So what you see with kingship is urbanization and intense sociocultural stratification. A king has to have courtiers, a king's family. You know, David has 19 sons and untold numbers of daughters. So that you're going to have all of these people are going to need support. They need soldiers they're going to conscript your sons. And how do monarchies support themselves? Taxes. So they're going to tax you, right? And God warns them about the socioeconomic effects of that and says that is ripe for injustice. That's ripe for exploitation. And indeed, what you see in the prophetic books, which are reflected in the history of the monarchy, is this deep anxiety that Israel has lost its way because of the intense social stratification that happens, that they are not caring for the poor, that people are bribing judges, people are exploiting poor people, people are held in debt slavery. When I talk about the economics of debt slavery and the Bible being against debt slavery, you can only be in debt to somebody for 7 years, right? Students really resonate with that. Forward, right, to these endless
Never
years.
mind the students.
Right, exactly. Everybody else debt slavery. So there's a lot of interesting ethical ideas. And one of the things that's fascinating in the Hebrew Bible is an enormous amount of suspicion of concentrated wealth and concentrated power. And in my opinion, Jesus carries through this prophetic tradition because he also spends a considerable amount of time in his ministry talking about the dangers of wealth and the problems of wealth. So that this is a communal problem. And one of the things I find fascinating about Judaism is if you read through Jewish law in the books of Deuteronomy and in Leviticus, you have this idea that you can't just rely on people doing the right thing, right? You have to have structured laws. You cannot just be relying on people to do the right thing. And so they will often have commentary on their laws. So for example, when they're talking about lending money and it's a 7-year cycle. So say you need to borrow money from me in year 5. I can't be like, oh, I'm only going to get 2 years of repayment. I'm not going to do it because it's a cultural time of debt relief, right? Everybody goes into debt relief. And so you can't just be like, oh, I'm only going to get 2 years of repayment from you. So I won't lend you now. I'll lend it to you later. So they are aware of people's tendencies to try to better their own lot. Yeah, to abuse the system. So you have this monarchy, which is a major turning point in Israel's history, where they go from largely being, nomads and then agriculturalists to being a true nation state with a standing army, a capital city in Jerusalem, and a national temple that is in Jerusalem. What ends up happening is that the center cannot hold. The people of Israel made of 12 tribes. And you can read very clearly in the Bible that the tribes sometimes feel like they're being treated unequally, right? So you have people in the north saying, hey, we're the ones with all the resources, with all the timber, for example, the cedars of Lebanon, with all the timbers and everything, and the labor force, and you're taxing us just to make your big city all fancy, right? So these kinds of regional resentments of power centers. Anybody ever heard of that? So regional resentment of power centers, you have that. So eventually what ends up happening is the nation divides and you end up having two nations. You have the Israel and you have Judah, and the nation of Judah. Eventually, the foreign overlords, the Assyrians, wipe out the northerners. So we only have Judah left, only Judah. And this is how we start eventually calling it not the religion of ancient Israel, but Judaism, and start talking about Jews, right? There aren't any Jews in the Hebrew Bible. There are no Jews there. The word Jews doesn't occur until much, much later. So, and then eventually though, the South itself falls. So that's the other big turning point, is that David establishes the true nation state in the year 1000. And by the time 500 years later, in 587, it falls. And that's it's no longer a nation state until 1948. It always is living under foreign rule. Now this moment in 587 is another key turning point. The temple is destroyed and the people of Israel are scattered out into the diaspora. The word diaspora just means scattered. So everybody's now living not in Israel, but out in the Mediterranean world, in Egypt and Babylon and all over the place. And you start to see Jews, you can even see this in the Bible, you start to see Jews saying like, okay, well, how can we be Jewish without a temple? And so this is also the period of time where you start to see an enormous amount of collecting and writing and editing and compiling of the Bible is happening in response to this experience. Because all the population is scattered, they don't have the land, they don't have a king, they don't have a temple. They're like, oh my gosh, we don't want to lose all of our traditions, our stories, our proverbs, our hymns, our laws. So this is when a lot of actual writing activity is being done to get the Bible in the form that we have it now. They also start thinking about other things. Can you be a Jew outside of the land of Israel? In Psalm 137, how can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? That was the pain of Egypt, that there were no altars to God. Can you be a Jew if you're not living in Israel? And the answer, of course, ends up being yes, but this is something that they really have to grapple with. You also start seeing at this time Jews grappling with the fact that they're a minority culture in other nations. Can I be a Greek and a Jew? Can I be an Egyptian and a Jew? I mean, within a generation, just like most Jews today, they're not born speaking Hebrew, right? They live in other lands. They live in America. They live in France. They live in New Zealand. They live, in Thailand, right? Jews live everywhere now. And so their religious identity is not linked to their national identity in the same way. And even when the Jews are allowed to return a couple generations later, when they're allowed to return by the Persians, who just have a different foreign policy, even when they're allowed to return, the vast majority of Jews don't. From this point on, there's more Jews, even today, there's more Jews living outside of Israel than inside Israel. And so this becomes a question, and this is where you start getting the notion that, number one, you can be a Jew without living in the land of Israel and your national identity being different. That means that your religious identity is different from your national identity, which the word for nation is ethnos, right, from your ethnic identity, and you start to get a separation of this. And this is one of the issues that continues to be an issue that Jews navigate, their cultural, national identity and their religious identity. But this is when we start to see, right, because Judah was killed. I mean, Judah was, the people in there were killed and put into exile. So people are like, oh, who are all these people? Oh, these are the people from Judah These are Judeans, and eventually that becomes Judaios, becomes Jews. And that's when you start to see in this post-exilic period, you start to see people being called Jews. You start to see people also saying like, oh, okay, well, if your national identity is not connected to your religious identity, oh, maybe people could convert. We have a story, for example, about the book in the book of Ruth. So this, and then they also are like, well, what's the status of non-Jews? If our God's the only God in the universe, what's going to happen to all these people? What's going on? So you start to see a lot of questions that continue to be a focus of Jewish conversation and theology and culture were all planted there. So they do eventually return, though. So they do eventually return. One other phenomenon that you start to see, sorry, that I wanted to mention, is you start to see the development of synagogues, because there's no temple. And also, frankly, if you're living in Athens, if you're living in Rome, if you're living in Sardis, if you're living in Miletus, you know, most likely you're never going to make it back, even once the temple is rebuilt, which it is, it's rebuilt, it's called the Second Temple, right? So you start to see the development of synagogues, which just means gathering place. And they're really much more like a JCC than what we would think of as a synagogue. They do worship there, but it's also for studying, it's for community hanging out, it's for celebrations, all kinds of things.
So what happened to the people of the north that were also?
Yeah, that's a great historical question. So they either come down and become part of Judah, and then their histories of Judea. Some people have argued that they're related to the Sumerians. Other people have argued they just become absorbed into Assyrian culture. So we don't, it's a historical mystery, what happens exactly to that population. Okay, so that is all what's going on in the aftermath of the exile. And that period of Judaism is called Second Temple Judaism, because it's the period of time when the Second Temple was built. But Jews are now just living throughout the Mediterranean world and in the land of Israel, and they're all under foreign rule. They're under foreign rule. So first the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Hellenistic kingdoms. There's a brief respite, but then they're under the Romans. So they're under the Romans. So they're under that. And what ends up happening is in the first century, you start to see a lot of Jewish armed resistance at the time of Jesus. I talk about this a lot in my New Testament class, Jewish armed resistance against their foreign overlords, against the Romans. This breaks out into a revolt, and the Jews are crushed. Thousands upon thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews are slaughtered. Tens of thousands of Jews are captured and enslaved, taken to Rome to be slaves, and the temple is destroyed, never to be rebuilt to this day. And now there's 2 mosques on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but never to be rebuilt. And sometimes students say to me like, well, why didn't they rebuild it? And I was like, they don't have control over the land. Right? They don't control the land. They don't own the land. They can't just go around rebuilding it. It's not their land. It's Roman land at that point. So this then is another major fundamental turning point. Jews don't have a temple. Their entire religion is based on making offerings of various kinds, sin offerings, thank offerings, offerings related to all their holidays in the temple, making these offerings to God. No longer available, still not available. And so obviously, what are the things that they have left? They have synagogues, and they have Torah. They don't have king, they don't have land, they don't have temple. But now, by this point, because of all that activity, we don't want to lose our laws in the first kind of crisis, then Torah becomes the center of Jewish religious life. And luckily, there was a group of people, the Pharisees, who get a bad rap in the New Testament, but the Pharisees who were learned Jewish men who revered the Torah and wanted to interpret the Torah. And long before the temple is destroyed, they develop a theology where they think to themselves, well, how can we import the sanctity of the temple into our daily lives? How can we do that? Every day could be a form of temple worship. And so they try to constitute their lives as a form of ethical living, constantly bringing reflection on the Lord and on creation. And one of the main ways they did that was through kosher eating. And through they organized themselves in a way as a table fellowship, which is why they always get into fights with Jesus over meals. But And there's all these meal scenes in the New Testament. So they constitute themselves, but it's a way of saying, every time you're eating, you're reflecting on the goodness of God. So they're poised then in the aftermath when there's no temple. They're poised because they've already thought about how can you live your daily life with sanctity without the temple. And they already have focused their interpretive and religious energy on the Torah, even though they revered the temple, but on the study of Torah. So there's a saying in rabbinic Judaism that develops that says basically keeping the Sabbath, keeping kosher, keeping and circumcising your sons, you can do those anywhere, right? All of those things can be done anywhere. You don't need to be in the land of Israel. And so in the wake of the destruction of the temple in 70, Jews, right, Jews have to figure out how can we go on being Jewish when we don't have that central aspect. And that's where you get the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism. And the Pharisees eventually become, they're the proto-rabbis, they exist there. And so rabbinic Judaism starts to focus on then the interpretation of Torah. The locus of sanctity has moved from the temple to the Torah, to the text itself. And that is the center of rabbinic Judaism, interpreting the laws to try to figure out ethical, righteous living for all Jews. And so you start to see then the production of new texts at this time that become the center of rabbinic Judaism. So we have the Bible or the Torah, and alongside Torah, the written law, you had oral traditions, because even in antiquity, things came up that weren't in the Bible, right? Just like, should we watch TV or not? That's not in the Bible, right? So how are you going to interpret that? Well, the rabbis talk about it, and they have debates and they have arguments. And this was the oral tradition. And what you start to, that oral tradition was revered by the Pharisees. So what you have in the Mishnah then is a written compilation of key points of oral law to help us to continue to interpret Torah. And so that's what the Mishnah is, if you've ever heard of that. It's broken up into sections interpreting different aspects of Jewish law. In the years after that, then you start to have the development of Jewish centers of learning in the great cities and rabbis. And what you have in the Talmud is then interpretations of the Mishnah, which are themselves interpretations of Torah. And so that's what you have in the Talmud. And there was a Talmud that developed in Babylon, and there was one that developed in Jerusalem. And that now is the center. So Talmud, which is has its root in terms of reading, learning. Lomedit means like I learn. And so Talmud represents all these historical conversations of rabbis that are all written up, surrounding then the commentary of the Mishnaic early rabbis, all surrounding Torah. And if we were a group of rabbis, we'd all be sitting there and we'd be having arguments. When does Shabbat begin, right? Well, there's all these different arguments. When you can't tell blue from green, when you see 3 stars in the sky, right? There's all these kinds of ways. And so we'd be having arguments about that. And then we go and we see, well, what did Rabbi Gamaliel say? What did Rabbi Hillel say? What did Maimonides say? And it's an ongoing conversation. And frankly, I think this is one of the most powerful things about Judaism, is that there's no sense that Torah is just, oh, you take it literally, that's it, read it, we know what it says. No, it's a text that endlessly repays interpretation and discussion. And so instead of saying like, let's figure out what the Bible says, the Jews will say, let's learn together. Let's learn together. Let's read the Bible, talk, argue, etc. Which is why you have the joke, 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. Right, that idea, because it's not right or wrong. The righteousness or piety comes in the discussion. Yes.
How are we able to access those updated writings?
Oh, they're everywhere. You can just get them in the library, you can get them online.
What, so what would you ask for?
The Talmud.
Oh.
Yeah, just type the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, right, and then you can see it. Mhm.
Okay.
Yep, it's available like any book. So that becomes then the center of Judaism. So that really is sort of ancient Judaism. And then we start to move into the rest of the history of Judaism and some key moments. So let's think then about European Judaism. Jews obviously spread from, you've got them in Israel, and then they spread out into the Mediterranean world, and then eventually they spread up into Europe. And Jews did not thrive equally in different European countries. You have Jews thriving considerably under Spain. In the Middle Ages in Spain are sometimes called the golden era of Jews living in Spain. They were not as well tolerated in other parts of Europe. They were victims of the First Crusade. There was a giant massacre of Jews, for example, in the Rhineland. So it was very uneven treatment. And one of the things that's fascinating is that Christians, all the way back to Augustine, it was like, well, why don't we just wipe out all the Jews? Like, we have all the power now. Why don't we just wipe them all out? And, that's what we should be doing. Their existence is a thorn in our side, right? Because Christians are saying this is the proper way for Judaism. And Jews are saying, no, it's not. This is the proper way for Judaism. And Augustine says, well, we need to leave them as a negative witness. So we want to Christianize Europe. And so let's have them be in Europe and we can be like, look how terrible they are. Look how terrible their lives are. So, I mean, this is a true thing, a negative witness. So they experienced a range of difficulties. So a couple other important figures and oppression, obviously the Crusades, you start to get accusations of blood libel, conspiracy theories about Jews, and Christian anti-Semitism is rampant throughout Europe. One of the most important key thinkers in the Middle Ages is a figure named Maimonides, who was born in Spain, but lives out the rest of his life as a physician in Cairo. And he was very, very interested in thinking about reason and faith. How can religion, how can we use logic? How can we use philosophy to try to understand the relationship between reason and revelation? And he wrote very famously a book called The Guide for the Perplexed. So how can we use rational explanations to think about the nature of God, why evil happens, things like that. He also, right, the vast majority of people cannot read Hebrew. Just like the vast majority of Jews today can't read Hebrew, right? So they can't read Hebrew. So he also wrote up a discussion. He listed and enumerated the 613 commandments, and in plain language, like explained what they meant. So Maimonides is an incredibly important figure and somebody who people refer back to all the time in Jewish thinking. Another kind of movement as we move into the later Middle Ages, you start to see Judaism split in some ways. On the one hand, you start to see the emergence of a lot of mystical and messianic movements. So in the medieval and early Renaissance period, you start to have various mystical texts. You have a kind of mysticism that's called sometimes Merkaba mysticism, which means chariot mysticism, which is a reflection on God and the nature of heaven and the notion of God's throne in heaven, which is a wheelchair, and the wheels are made out of fire. So this is, that's described in the Bible. And so where is God located? I mean, everybody thought that God lived in the world. I mean, lived in the temple, but if the temple's not there, where is God? Where is the holy presence of God? And so it's a reflection on that and on the nature of God. So you have various mystical movements, all of which have come together to generally be called the Kabbalah. So Kabbalah or Kabbalah mysticism. is a key, notion that you don't just read Torah. There's secret meanings, there's esoteric teachings, there's, deeper teachings about how you can become one with God, how you can live a righteous life. So it's mystical, meditative, reflective, teachings. And two ideas develop out of that. One is the notion of a kind of tree of life that is connected with various different emanations or energy. Like if you're trying to think about the nature of God, he's a creative life force. And so life, righteousness, piety, love, truth, right? All these emanations come out from God. And you also have this notion of, again, the sense of obligation, tikkun olam, right? This notion that emerges out of the mystical reflection at this time. We have a radical obligation to repair the world, right? This is God's creation. God is the creative life force in the universe, and we have an obligation to work with God to repair creation. So this is still a guiding force in many Jews' lives as a force for ethical action, working with God to engage in spiritual, but also sort of social, ethical, moral practices to repair the world, right? To bring the whole world in harmony. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, if you think about Mahayana Buddhism with the Bodhisattva, this idea we have a responsibility, not just for our own enlightenment or salvation, but for that of everybody in our community. And that is a deep principle within Judaism. So that's the medieval and early, those are the main kind of things that there's also then a lot of messianic movements. So obviously Christianity is a tradition that claims that the Messiah, the word Christ just means Messiah, that the Messiah was Jesus. But Jews do not believe that. Jews do not believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so Jews are still waiting for the Messiah. And periodically, you have messianic movements emerge. And there were a lot of messianic movements in the Renaissance period. In Shabbatai Zvi is a very famous one. And again, it's born out of situations of feeling so oppressed, always anti-Semitism, always treated as a troublesome minority in majority countries, despite that kind of golden period in Spain. And when those pressures become too great, it's not surprising that you start to see Jewish hopes turn to messianic hopes, wanting to have somebody who's going to come in, liberate God's people, and establish a kingdom of God. So then as we move into the Enlightenment period, along with everybody else in Europe, you start to have the rise of various different forms of what we would think of as science. So obviously astronomy, but you also have things like botany and zoology and biology and geography and archaeology and history, right? I mean, and religious Jews are not immune to this. Education is a centrally important value within Judaism. And so you start to see then Jewish thinkers start to think about how can we, just as Maimonides did a little bit in his Guide to the Perplexed, think about the relationship between reason and faith, and also intersecting that with the sociocultural problems of being a minority, and in many cases a hated minority in most of the countries in which Jews live, right? Is it something about our traditions that is keeping us separate? So most famously is Moses Mendelssohn. He said, look, we Jews, we need to modernize. We need to be more integrated. We don't want to be so isolated. We want to be fully integrated, right? We don't want to be Jews who happen to live in Germany. We don't want to be Jews who happen to live in Poland, right? We want to be Poles who happen to be Jewish. That's really a way to put it. And also we need to modernize, right? We need to have not just Jewish education in yeshivas. We need to get our children, et cetera, need to have secular educations. We need to be educated in the vernacular language. The Bible needs to be translated, right? Just like Christians are wanting to translate the Bible. And that sparked part of the Protestant Reformation. So too, the Bible's in Hebrew. Most people can't read it, right? It needs to be translated into the vernacular. And so trying to say, look, just be Jewish in your private life. We don't need to be don't be so Jewish out in the world. Be more secular, learn, study and live and learn in the language of your country. Don't live in these kinds of ghettos. And we'll have almost in a way blaming Jews for their own separatism. At that time. So you start to have, and in general, this is part and parcel of what's going on in the 17th and 18th century. You have other philosophers, not within Judaism, but they're basically saying religion is causing a lot of political problems, right? The Reformation ended up 100 years of war in Europe, and people are starting to think religion is the problem. And so Jews are part and parcel of that conversation, but just with their own particular concerns. Because at this time, this is where you start having people saying, we need to get religion out of political life. We need to detach religion from national identity. We can't have Spanish Catholics coming over to kill German Protestants on the part of other German Protestants. We can't have that, right? And that's right, central to our ideas about the founding of America, right? People coming over and saying, we want to have our religious identity be private and have nothing to do with the state. Well, here you've got internally Moses Mendelssohn saying, yes, let's move forward with that. Let's modernize, let's integrate, let's speak the vernacular, let's get educated, not just in yeshiva and Torah, but in every way. So he ends up being a kind of key thinker for the development of Reform Judaism. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. Another famous philosopher at this time, who was very much part of this conversation and thinking that religion or religious bodies were responsible, meaning like the church or something like that, were responsible for violence, for nationalist violence. He also critiqued traditional religion, and he also, in a way, was essentially a kind of deist or a pantheist. He just believed in a kind of generic spirit, almost identifying it with the natural world, a kind of naturalist spirit, but also he was also against this separatist notion of Jews as a separate people, a special people. They're like, that's hurting us. That claim that we're a special people, a separate people, that's hurting us. So now eventually, Baruch was basically kicked out of Judaism. They didn't really like that, but he was a very, very important speaker. So you start to see Jewish thinkers, just like everybody at that time, trying to incorporate ideas about science, trying to think about the identity of Jews. How does their religious identity relate to their nationalist identity, with more and more movement towards saying, how can we integrate into European culture more effectively while maintaining our Jewish identity? And this has been a balancing act that Jews have had to engage in all the way since 586 BCE, 587 BCE. So then you start to have in the 19th century, some new conversations about that you start to have on the reverse side, people like Theodor Herzl saying, yeah, it's not going to work. We are perpetually being treated as a problematic minority and are being systematically excluded from political life, sometimes from cultural life and things like that. We need our own homeland, right? That's what all the problems are, right? So the exact opposite idea of somebody like Mendelssohn, who's saying, let's stop being so separatist, let's fully integrate into our countries, drive carefully. Here you have Herzl saying, no, we need to have our own homeland. We're never going to be able to fully thrive and be our own people if we don't have our own land. We're always going to be strangers in a strange land, and it's not going to work well. So you have, this notion of Zionism, that needs to be a Jewish land where we can be safe, not suffer from pogroms, not forced to live in ghettos, not treated like minorities. None of that is any good. So you start to get the seeds of Zionism at that time. And then in the 19th century, this is where, and I'll talk about them in just a minute. This is where you start to get sectarianism based on the extent to which some Jews are following the path of Enlightenment thinkers and people like Mendelssohn and people who are wanting to modernize and they want to be Jewish, but they also want to fully participate in modern society. And then you have people who are like, no, 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 no. We have to really, really stick to and preserve our Jewish identity in our traditional way. These things are starting to happen in the 19th and 20th century. This is where you start to get the division, those kind of Jewish divisions, denominations, so to speak, within Judaism are all emerging out of these kinds of conversations. And all in a way are, how should we respond to modernity? How should we do that balancing act of our religious identity and our national and sociocultural identity? What's the status of Israel, right? They're all, because they have different, how traditional should we be? How traditional should we not be, et cetera, et cetera. So all these kinds of questions start coming up in the 19th and 20th century. So as we know, the 20th century, not a great century for the Jews. They become scapegoats for Hitler and the Holocaust. And in the wake of that, in an attempt to ameliorate the fact that the nations of the world did not act quickly enough to stop the slaughter of 6 million Jews and 20 million other people, and the destruction of a continent, that basically, as a way to say sorry for that, the UN says you can have Israel. But of course, we know other people are living there. And, I don't necessarily want to get into it. We can if we want to people at the end. But that has now set into motion the conflict of Jews going to Israel. Should it be a Jewish homeland? Should it not be a Jewish homeland? Should it, how exactly is the nation state of Israel going to be related to Jews and Judaism? It's one thing to say we want to have a nation state of Israel. It's another thing to say, well, we want this to be a kind of theocracy. We want this to be a Jewish state, right? We don't like it when people say they want it to be an Islamic state. We don't like it, I don't think, when people say this is a Christian state, or Hindus who want to say this is a Hindu state, Hindus only. But Jews are saying this in a Jewish state. But because of the history of slaughter, it's been very difficult to challenge that. And it's a major struggle for Jews who live in Israel and Jews who live outside of Israel. And it has all the main clashes in Israel are over these kinds of tensions. So if you think about the Yom Kippur War, the 6-Day War, all of the incursions and the Intifada, because other people are living there, right? Palestinians were already living there when the Jews come, and they were forcibly displaced. So this is a troubling issue. But on the other hand, in the wake of the Holocaust, where were the Jews going to be resettled? They had all been displaced. Survivors had fled. They were all were displaced from their homes. Where were they going to go? What countries were going to take them? We've seen how Europe and America feels about taking in displaced refugees, people who have suffered from violence. They're not endlessly welcoming. So to some extent, this seemed in a way to be a solution to this problem of what are we going to do with all of these Jews that we did not protect. So it's a very, very complex issue. Okay, so that in a way is the history of Judaism with these key moments. And coming out of that, then we have various different Jewish groups and Jewish movements. So let me scooch forward. So I'll make sure that I'm giving you all the right information. So if you think about the different forms of Judaism, so one, Orthodox Judaism, right? That in a way might just be traditional Judaism. There's lots of variations. There's modern Orthodox, there's other kinds of Orthodox, but Orthodox Judaism really emerges as you have people like Mendelssohn saying, hey, Let's stop being isolated. Let's be fully integrated into France. Let's be fully integrated into Italy. Let's be fully integrated into Poland, right? Let's be fully integrated. And Orthodox see that, which is a very biblical view, see that, well, we're going to lose everything. We're going to become overly assimilated, right? Much of the anxiety in the Bible is about Jews becoming overly assimilated via intermarriage, via living in other lands, all sorts of ways. So the Orthodox, the emergence of a distinctive identity as Orthodox only emerges really in the 18th and 19th centuries when you finally have somebody else saying like, hey, we don't all need to live in the shtetl. We don't all need to live in the ghettos. We can be emancipated. We can send our kids to University of Germany. We can send our kids to, Vienna, we can do all of that. We can and still be Jewish. Orthodox Jews resisted that and continued to persist in living highly traditional lives. I'll talk about Hasidim as a special form of Orthodox in a minute. The next kind of movement that we can think about is Reform Judaism, right? So that's the movement of people like Mendelssohn, right? That's the other side. Let's integrate. We can, what some people even to some extent are saying like, well, we can just be ethical monotheists. Lots of Reform Jews, for example, don't keep kosher. That we can modernize. We don't have to keep up with these old traditions of these, desert nomads wrote down 3,000 years ago. We don't need to do that. We can modernize. And that is Reform Judaism. And so I think Temple Brit Kodesh is a Reform synagogue. Is Sinai? Sinai is Reform. So there's a lot of people in America, a lot of Reform Jews. Then you also have conservative, which the pendulum swings one way, Orthodox new as an actual identity, which could only be developed in contradistinction to Reform Judaism, the liberalizers. And then you have conservatives who are like, well, we want to be modern, but we also want to be traditional. Right? We still want to fully keep all of the Jewish traditions, fully identify strongly as a distinctive population, not just be completely assimilated, but we're happy to go to Harvard, we're happy to go to Princeton, et cetera. So, but we still keep very strict rules and very strict traditions about Judaism, keeping kosher, all of those kinds of things. We're not going to fully integrate, we're going to maintain our distinctive identity, right? They're trying to hold a position in the middle. Another kind of form of Judaism, which is not as well known and not as popular, was actually started by a particular man named Mordecai Kaplan, where he basically is called Reconstructionist Judaism. And he basically doesn't believe in God. He's basically an atheist Jew. How can we have Jews and be a cultural identity? Being Jewish and being a cultural identity. I mean, I would say I grew up as a cultural Christian. My parents were free love hippies. And we celebrated Christmas and Easter. We did that all the time. So, we sang Hark the Herald Angels Sing. We did all those kinds of things, right? So he's trying to say a kind of ethical monotheism. This is the gift that Judaism has given to the world, is a kind of ethical monotheism, an idea of obligation, that the cultural activities around meals and things like that, that's fundamentally important in our holidays, but you don't need to believe in God. We don't need to have all of these backwards traditions. We don't need to do those kinds of things. So that's Reconstructionist Judaism. But so Jewish community, Jewish people, we're a distinct people, but we're cultural Jews. I would say a lot of my students fit into this. A lot of my students who identify as Jewish, I would say they're not particularly religious, even though they're deeply, deeply, deeply Jewish. So you've got that. And then the final form that I want to talk about, because we might know because of our proximity to New York City, are Hasidic Jews. Hasidic Jews are particularly Jews who mostly come from Eastern Europe, from the shtetls in Eastern Europe. Their distinctive clothing is a classic example of fossilized fashion. It's called fossilized fashion. The Amish also have fossilized fashion, right? Wherever they were when they established it, right? That's what they wear. So that's why they look like that. One of the things about Hasidism is it's Orthodox, obviously intensely Orthodox, but it also contains elements of mysticism, of emotional joy. They sell a lot of dancing, a lot of kind of joyful weeping in their worship, a lot of singing, dancing, celebration, etc. But they're a very insular community, and that keep very strict boundaries between themselves, right? They live, the most famous Hasidic community lives in New York City, but there's also there's whole towns of Hasidic Jews in upstate New York. So Hasidic Judaism. So those are the main forms of Judaism. So we just went through the Jewish history. And if you look at Jewish holidays, you have Rosh Hashanah, a new year. Most have New Year's. You have Sukkot, which is a harvest celebration. But a lot of Jewish holidays, my Nora Rubel, who I think has come here to teach for you, she'll joke and say something like that Jewish holidays, typically it's, they tried to kill us, but they didn't. Let's eat, right? So you've got that with sober, right? They enslaved us, they tried to kill us. Let's eat. That's celebrating the Exodus, that a lot of them are remembering their past, right? The history, Judaism is ground in history because they're religious scriptures they conceptualize as not just containing legends of their heroes and their God, but also historical elements. In a way, nobody's claiming the Mahayana is historical. Nobody's claiming that the Bhagavad Gita is historical, right? These are powerful myths that have shaped Indian consciousness, but nobody's saying that happened in history. For Jews, their religious identity is deeply connected to their history. And so their religion is a lot of remembering that history so that they never forget. So you've got Pesach, where they're commemorating the Exodus, Hanukkah, when they're commemorating when Judaism was illegalized and then the Maccabees resisted. Purim from the book of Esther, where the Jews were tried to be killed by the Persians and they won. So that is a kind of joke that Jews will say to themselves, they tried to kill us, they couldn't kill us, let's eat. So, but typically I have a professor who then teaches Jewish history, teaches biblical history. I had one at Harvard who taught it by teaching the liturgical year. He would go around the liturgical year, and that would enable him to talk about not just Jewish practices and Jewish holidays and things like that, but also about Jewish history and why memory is so fundamentally important. Otherwise, I would say there's daily practices of prayer, but the most well-known daily practice is keeping kosher. That kosher food laws, that this has been a primary feature of Jewish identity from the very beginning. And it also has been one of the main ways that people have criticized Jews as being separatists, like you won't even eat with us. Right, this idea that sharing food and commensality is so fundamentally important. Shabbat and the weekly celebration of Shabbat. It's central to family life in Judaism. Again, you can keep the Sabbath anywhere. A famous rabbinic saying is, as much as Jews keep the Sabbath keeps the Jews. If we could just remember our God and his role in creation, that would be great. So what are the things that Judaism has in a way, kind of some of their sort of main things? One is monotheism, right? They're the oldest monotheistic tradition that we know about, the claim that there is just one God and that God is the creator of the universe. Also, the notion that they have a special relationship with that God and that they are the chosen people, that they have this separatist identity, a special and distinctive identity. And that has been used to accuse Jews of being an arrogant people, of being a separatist people. But connected to that, though, is the deep sense that God has chosen the Jewish people not because they're so special, but because he's chosen them to have a distinctive obligation to show the world how to live ethically. And you can see this idea, for example, in the book of Isaiah, We are to be light to the world. We are a light, the Jewish people are a light to the world, and we have an ethical obligation to tikkun olam, repair the world. So ethics and morality and ethical action is key. And so that idea, the next idea to that is the notion of Jewish law. Elie Wiesel made the point one time, he said, when God comes to talk to Moses, you'd expect a kind of mystical experience, but you don't. You get law. These are how you live ethically. This is how you construct an ethical society. Within Judaism, if you're doing fine, but you're living in an ethically, socio-economically troubling society where there's sick people and poor people and evil and all this sort of thing, and you're not actively working to repair that, you will not reap the benefits. It doesn't matter how you're doing. It matters how is your community doing. Your obligations to God and the gifts you're going to get from God are only going to be as good as the extent to which you care for your community. So you have to engage in mitzvot, good actions, ethical living, follow the commandments. That's key and central. I think that one of the so that's, ideas that they have about the role of Jewish people. The other key thing that continues to be problematic is the place of Israel. It is in their Bible that God promised them this land, and that is now being used, I think, in a malevolent way to destroy a population, and has been used since 1948 to deny other people rights. The vast majority of Jews that I know, whether they're not Zionist or not Zionist, but they basically saying the state of Israel is not Judaism. And the conflation of that is itself deeply problematic for many, many Jews. But this is probably the issue that is most fractious for Jews, even apart from the horrors that are going on in Palestine and in Gaza right now, that's probably one of the hardest things. And then another kind of perennial question is around the relationship between Jews and secularism. Jews do have this history where they have always been seen as a distinctive population within any country that is not Israel, a distinctive minority population. And so how have Jews adapted to that? What is the relation? How do you balance your religious identity and your national identity? Can you be Jewish and fully French? Can you do those kinds of things? So for example, in terms of Islam, which we'll talk about next week, French people are basically saying, if you're Islamic, you can't be French, right? I mean, that's essentially the position of many right-wing people in France. Well, you have these kinds of conversations within Judaism as well. How is our national cultural identity or ethnos, identity as an ethnos, how does that relate it to our identity as Jews, as a people? Okay, so that is Judaism. Yes.
The idea originally that the Jews killed Jesus. Doesn't the New Testament record that it was the Romans?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. The first instance that we have of that charge is in a sermon by a man named Melito, who comes from Sardis. And he's writing in the 2nd century. And he's basically in the 2nd century, there are so many writings on Christians talking about what is our relationship to Jews and Judaism. In Jewish writing, there's not a peep about Christians. They don't care. Like they're moving on. They've got their other things to do. They've been around for 2,000 years. Here's this Johnny come lately sect. Whereas Christians are like, oh my gosh, we're saying we're the continuation of Judaism, but these pesky Jews are still existing. And so he has this whole sermon where he's trying to explain how terrible and awful the Jews are. And that's where you see the claim that they were responsible for killing Jesus. And then it just, I mean, people believe all kinds of things that are not in the Bible. So people have many mistaken notions about what's in the Bible, but that's where it comes from. And that does become a charge.
So say his name again.
Melito, Melito, Melito of Sardis. That's the first point where we have that written.
Two things, but my first related to that one is I have a dear friend that's Jewish who thought that because I was Presbyterian, that meant that I thought that the Jews killed Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's the first I had ever heard of it. in
Yeah.
my life. Messianic Jews.
Yeah.
Think of them.
Jews
Does
for
that come with
Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so there are people who, not very many, but there are people who are born Jewish who today, in the modern world, who come to believe that Jesus was in fact indeed the Messiah, but they fully identify as Jews. So Paul was a Jew for Jesus. Paul at no point does Paul ever refer to himself as a Christian. The word Christian is not in the New Testament, in the way that we think about it. It's Jew versus non-Jewish. And he's like, I am a Jew. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I am descended from Abraham, da, 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 da. So he's a Jew for Jesus. So there are some Jews for Jesus, today, but they're not a very big minority.
So I have a dear Christian friend who became a Messianic Jew.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because they just, and most Jews, I would say, view Jesus as, an incredible wisdom teacher, of which there are many.
There's a question on the screen. Hopkey.
Eleanor.
Yeah, my question is for those of us who didn't make it in person, is there a way we can get the handouts?
I'm gonna be scanning it. If I'm not sure I understand everybody who's up there since you're not listing all your names, but I'll send it to those I know. I scan them and keep all your handouts anyway. It's not like.
Well, I think there's plenty of extras, so maybe.
There's two.
Oh, okay, well, there's two extras, so, typically, I think they're scanned and then sent out.
Should
So
that
yes.
not be on our website for,
Yeah, it's probably easier to target the,
put on the website,
We're recording it too.
we're also recording it.
I
yeah,
think it goes on our.
It's on the
website.
YouTube
so the
On the
YouTube,
YouTube.
channel.
even better.
It's, yeah, I'm talking about the physical pieces of paper handouts.
Paper, yes, yeah,
Yeah,
We'll try and make sure that
we'll
happens.
make sure you get one.
Okay, those of you who know me, somebody talk among yourselves and decide who's going to give me one.
Tell Eleanor and Karen has one for her.
Okay,
Well-
thank you.
Islam, which has origins that emerge out of Judaism in some ways. And so we'll be talking about Islam next week. And then you'll know everything there is to know.
And since we've enjoyed Anne Meredith for more than quarter century, we would like to, if she's willing, bring her back next.
Yay!
So if you have ideas about what you would like her to
Subject.
talk about, what angle, there was a craving for some look at other religions, that what shaped this year. We've talked about food in the Bible.
Yeah.
We've had various different vantages.
Yeah.
So Anne seems to like a challenge.
Yeah.
Years, what I've done is send her the theme that Third is working on. And so that's
Yeah.
where food came out, because remember, it was breaking bread together,
Yeah,
and so.
Or storytelling you at
What
that.
what
so
Ann
you
does
use this as a
exceptionally
storyteller.
well is you give her something like that, she says, oh, yes, I can take care of that. And then it's a fascinating few weeks about
well,
it.
maybe you could give us something we need and never knew.
Never knew that
You
you
need.
Well, I don't know, you guys are pretty on top of things.
Yeah.
I'll think of some ideas for now. I'll come up with them next week.
Yeah,
that'd be great. I have a question.
Yes.
Most of us are slightly older.
Yes.
really?
Would you say, would you be able to tell us what you see with your students?
Oh,
Yeah.
And the
she said that,
disconnect?
it's,
Or how to, I
They're
don't want to say
afraid.
there is a gap, but to
Yeah.
close
they're
a
afraid.
gap,
Yeah,
what would
with the
be,
younger people.
like what drives them nuts is based on what we believe and
Parents.
what they think the truth they believe and what they believe or they don't know they believe yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard because, I think one of the main problems, which I'm not sure how much you can affect, but one of the main problems that I see is that the cultural discourse around Christianity, those people whose shrill voices, have captured the airwaves, present such an unloving and unwelcoming and, they are all about social justice and, I feel like saying, well, go to the church. And that's where you have a structure for engaging in social justice, right? And, I think that, but the step against LGBTQ, that is massive. The fact that, the Christian discourse is so unloving in that way, I think is probably one of the main concerns. And now its association with Trump is so deeply hard. But yes, I can think about that too, as well. Think about But
So-
they are anxious lost souls, I gotta tell you, I mean,
So
to
Ann
some
and I-
extent, I wanna tell them like, it's gonna be okay, but I don't know if it is.
So Ann and I got to know each other on the board of
Yeah.
a regional campus ministry group.
Yeah,
And we support campus ministry,
yeah,
especially on those campuses that are secular
yeah,
to start with, so don't already have money going toward ministry. And so for some of you know this about us, but
Yeah.
the University of Rochester and RIT now together have a wonderful chaplain who is working to bring ministry to campus and incredibly GLBTQ plus A
Yeah.
friendly and the kind of place we want young people to be growing up and trying to do
Yeah.
social justice and talk about social justice together. So supporting college ministry is a huge thing.
yeah, and it's just, and also about how do you reach those students who might just feel kind of spiritually hungry or looking for some way
That's what
to
we're
think
hoping.
about their lives, right? But all they see about Christianity is,
Ugly.
ugly,
Yeah.
in my opinion. But it's just so hard to counter that. I mean, I have people ask me things all the time. I mean, now less and less am I willing to say in public, like on a bus or a plane, just say like I'm an ancient historian because I'll just be trapped with, loony. But I'm loony.
Mhm.
Oh,
See, that's the thing. They'll think I'm the crazy person. If I say like, oh, well, I study, I teach the Bible. People have all kinds of notions. Like I said, people don't know what's in the Bible or not in the Bible. And that's because it's been hijacked.
Hijack.
The discourse, I think the discourse around religion, around Israel has been hijacked by conservative Christians.
Yeah.
Who are no friend of the Jews, they're gonna be fair weather friends.
Yeah.
So I don't know why the Jews are falling for that, but it's hard. It's hard. Okay, so
Okay.
next to think about for next week in addition to Islam.